Welcome to this month's Community Coffee Hour. I'm Tammy Spencer Helms. I almost introduced myself like it was a podcast. I'm Tammy Spencer Helms, and I work with Mentor Virginia as a learning facilitator and curriculum developer. And this month I've gotten the opportunity to hear this person speak before, so I'm very excited. You're in for a treat. We have Tovah Denaro here, who is going to talk to us about protecting trans youth. So welcome, everyone. This is going to be really exciting. Again, this is Mentor Virginia. Our mission is to foster quality mentoring relationships that empower, elevate, and encourage young people. We offer training. We do AmeriCorps Vista. We do no-cost consulting through the NMRC, and we do National Quality Mentoring System checklist type things. This is our team, our lovely team. We have Pamela Johnson, who is our Youth Impact Coordinator. Cindy Montalvo is our AmeriCorps Vista Program Supervisor. Our fearless leader, Virginia Patterson, the Executive Director. Emma Rush is our Marketing Communication Coordinators, and then there's myself, and I'm actually the Learning Facilitator and Curriculum Developer now for Mentor Virginia. So this is our team. We are mighty. Here are our lovely consultants, Dr. Nashawn Battle, Dwayne Bennett, James Harris, John Harris, Laura Leporati, Tammy Mobley, Bianca Myrick, Angela Patton, and Allison Roberts. So these are the folks that will be working with you if you sign up for no-cost consulting or if you invite us in to do a training with you. So we're excited. We have a great team, and we're really excited to jump in today. So I will talk a little bit about our topic, and then I'm gonna pass it to Tovah. So our topic today is on protecting trans youth. We know that it is Pride Month, one of my favorite months of the year. So what I want to know from you all, you can either, raise your hand or put it in the chat, is what brought you here today? And what questions do you have about the topic? If you want to go ahead and put your questions in the chat, that'll be helpful because we'll make sure that those get answered throughout the time. So why are you here? And what questions do you have? We'll go ahead and give you a few minutes, and then Tovah, you can start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and pull my slide deck up as people are either typing in the chat or want to unmute and ask a question. I'm always curious to know the population of youth that you all are working with and what brings you to a training like this. I'll give folks another minute or so to use the chat box, and then I'll get started. It's a really good question, Tamise, which we will be covering. We will definitely talk about that. All right, well, please feel free to continue using the chat box and let me know if there's any questions that you want to make sure I cover. But I'm going to go ahead and jump into this so that we also have some time at the end to do any questions that you might have. So like Tamise mentioned, today we are really going to be talking about and focusing on how we mentor and support our LGBTQIA+ youth population. In particular, we're going to be talking about transgender youth and supporting transgender students. We're going to do, I'll give a little introduction of myself. We're going to go over some agreements before we jump into this training. And then I am going to be talking pretty specifically about laws that are going on in Virginia right now, some changes to some of the laws in Virginia, as well as the larger federal laws that protect transgender youth. We will be talking about terminology today. So if I say anything right now that you're like, what the heck is Tovah referring to, that's totally fine. Put a pin in it because I will be going over the different terms that we'll be using today. We'll go into the data. So I'll be looking at and showing you all national data for transgender and LGBTQIA+ youth, as well as some of the data that's specific for Virginia. And then today we're really going to also be focusing on intersectionality. There's a lot that has come up about suicide and suicide ideations among transgender youth, but in particular, transgender BIPOC youth, so transgender youth of color that we're going to be talking about. And then we'll wrap up with very specific and intentional strategies for how you all can walk away today and be an ally immediately and an advocate and a strong mentor for our queer youth population. So just as some background information about who I am and how I got started in this work, I am an education and behavioral consultant. So I live in Washington State, and I work for about 15 school districts across the state of Washington. I support behavioral practices within schools, so really focusing on the mental health needs and supports of youth. And that's kind of like the one main hat I wear. And then the second main hat I wear is supporting school districts and school systems across the country, really, on supporting transgender and gender expansive youth. I got into this work in 2011 when I was a high school special education teacher and ended up supporting Seattle Public Schools in opening up their first ever gender neutral bathrooms. So I was part of the policy making and the bill creation for that, along with 10 of my high school students that were part of the facilitation of that as well. Since then, I do a lot of curriculum development that involves trauma-informed and gender-inclusive sex education that I present and work through across the state of Washington. So we'll be talking about utilizing appropriate language today. This was actually one of the questions that Tamis brought in to the chat in regard to what does it look like when we're talking about when we misgender an individual versus kind of like some of the outright or derogatory discrimination. So we'll be addressing that today. We'll talk about and go into an increased awareness of the complexity of the gender spectrum. We're going to understand privilege, understand cisgender privilege and intersectionality, and then learn allyship as a verb. So it's really not just saying I'm an ally for the trans community, but what does that actually look like? During this session, please feel free, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat as well as the other Mentor Virginia folks, and so we're happy to answer as we go. Some of our agreements for this session, and it's a nice, intimate, it's a small group today, so I'm able to, if there's a question that comes up immediately, please don't hesitate to unmic yourself or use the raise hand emoji, and I'm happy to get to you. All right, so I want to start with what the U.S. protections, in particular in schools, look like for transgender youth. And youth are actually protected under Title IX. So as we know, Title IX is through the U.S. Department of Education, but it's actually a federal civil rights law, and it prohibits discrimination based on sex. Over the last handful of years, it has actually extended to file and look into claims of discrimination based on gender identity as well. And that also includes the failure to conform to stereotypical notions of masculinity or femininity. And so really what this means is that individuals that are feeling as though they're being harassed, intimidated, or bullied within a school system are able to present that information based on their gender identity through a federal court system under Title IX. And it's really interesting because while I was doing research and unpacking the laws that Virginia has currently, I looked through this state profile of LGBTQ plus supports for youth, the laws and policies that Virginia has. And there are actually currently some really strong laws for protecting youth that identify under the queer umbrella. So right now we do have a law in Virginia that includes non-discrimination and policies covering LGBTQ plus students. So a law exists to support youth based on sexual orientation as well as gender identity. Conversion therapy is also banned in Virginia, which is really powerful because we know that conversion therapy statistically has led to significant increase in suicide among LGBTQ plus youth. And in regard to sexual orientation, there are protections for queer youth in the child welfare system. So that's another big part of the work that I do in Washington State is I am part of and support the child welfare system for transgender youth in particular. And when I say the welfare system, I'm talking about the foster care system as well as the juvenile prison system. And so every state has different policies that protect transgender youth within the juvenile justice system. And some of the work that I do in Washington is to adapt and recreate these policies to be more inclusive. All of the slides that are up today, you will have access to. So any of the resources that I'm referencing, this one, for example, you'll be able to click on the live link to pull this up and unpack, learn a little bit more about the data and the laws that are protecting queer youth within Virginia. Now, what we know is that there has been a really big shift in the last couple of years because of the new governor of Virginia that has been presenting a lot of anti-LGBTQ plus policies within the state of Virginia. In particular, a big one, a really hot topic that has come up lately is the protection of essentially outing transgender students within the school system. And so there have been actually 12 anti-transgender bills that were introduced just this past session. And in Virginia, and I'll show you the next slide, there was 2 bills that were actually passed by the House. And so what's important to know about this, and this is the information as of this past March, that although these bills did pass by the House, there's still a lot of debate over what that is actually going to look like, especially because of the federal laws that protect transgender students. And so let me click, again, you will have access to all of these, but I want to make sure I get through all of my slides. So anything that is in blue, you will be able to click on the live link and read up on this information if you're curious about it. But what's important to know, the two laws that passed under the House, the Republican-controlled House, were in regards to school administrators actually having to out students for their gender identity to families, to parents. And the other one in regard to students being required to play on sports teams of the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, we've seen a lot of new laws and regulations come up about transgender individuals in sports, but this law targets specifically high school and middle school aged youth, as well as university aged youth and young adults. The other thing that's important to know is that for any individual that chooses to change their name through the court system, it's an expensive process and it's a long process. And if you are under the age of 18, you are required to have both parents consenting to that. The law that is coming up for Virginia under this new potential policy is that children would have to change their name legally before being able to change their name in the school system. School systems all have what's called a school information system, a data program that can very easily change names to be a nickname for a child or a chosen name. And so this new policy that was passed by the House is saying that children cannot change their name unless they legally change it. And all of this is really important to recognize the power behind some of these laws and the concern behind some of these laws because of how it impacts our youth, in particular, our suicide ideations and suicide attempts of transgender youth. The work that I do, and one of the first things I always say to individuals is I do not believe that talking about gender identity or sexual orientation is a conservative versus liberal conversation. It's about being human. Last year, just in Pierce County, where I live in Washington, I attended 4 funerals of children under the age of 16 that completed suicide. And there was a direct correlation with those youth not being able to access gender affirming care. And so I think it's just really important for me to put that out there, that we are choosing in our country to really politicize human beings. And at the end of the day, this is about how are we supporting our kids. The first thing to understand is that LGBTQ plus youth are at more than double the risk of homelessness compared to non-LGBTQ plus peers. And a big part of this is because when youth come out, they have a higher likelihood of being kicked out of their home. In Seattle, Washington, as well as in Tacoma, Washington, we have multiple youth shelters that are only for LGBTQ youth. And that's not because they are choosing to experience homelessness. It's because families have been kicking them out of their homes, as well as experiencing much more physical and sexual abuse at home. And like I said, I also work very closely with youth who are incarcerated. This data came from 2017, so it's a couple years old, but it's important to know that LGB, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth, are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, in particular for individuals that identify as girls or female. So almost 40% of girls in juvenile justice facilities identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, as compared to about 7% of the national average. It's also important to know, and we see how our systems in our country go hand in hand, and we're going to talk about this intersectionality, that 85% of youth that identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual in the juvenile justice system are also youth of color, right? And so we know that there are many systems working against minoritized individuals, and the justice system, or the quote unquote justice system, is one of those. Nearly 40% of incarcerated girls identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and 85 to 90% of incarcerated queer individuals are youth of color, right? So overall, the percentage of incarcerated queer youth is double than that of the general queer youth population in the country. And we also know that there have been some really powerful studies out of the mentor organization, the nationwide mentor organization, about mentorship and the correlation of decreasing youth in the prison system. And so being able to have, and I'm going to go into the relationship building, but being able to have a strong adult mentor can significantly decrease the risk factors that are placing youth into prison right now. We also see a significantly higher rate of sexual abuse for our lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth in the prison system. There are more laws coming out right now. There's the PREA Act that is supporting youth and decreasing the likelihood of sexual contact with staff, but we're still seeing higher rates within our queer youth population. So I've been using a couple terms now, and again, please feel free if you have any questions about the data. You will have these slides after this session, but if you have any questions, go ahead and plug into the chat. But we're going to dive into the terminology. I've been using some language, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the different terminology. I don't have the time, none of us do, to go into all of the different terms that are under the queer umbrella. We call this the alphabet soup within the community. And so I do have 2 different resources for you to access if you want to learn more and dive a little bit deeper into the terminology. But the thing that's important to know is that even myself, I do this work all the time. There are new terms that come up for me that I'm like, I did not know that yesterday. And that is okay, right? This is all about learning and educating ourselves. The more letters that we add to this acronym is really just about precision and a spirit of inclusion, and recognizing that people are continuing to evolve and continuing to identify themselves in an inclusive way. And so that's really what the alphabet soup is about. You will hear me say throughout the presentation queer. When I was a kid, the term queer was not a term that I would be allowed to use. It was an inappropriate term, a derogatory term, and now the queer community has really owned it and taken it back. The term queer is completely appropriate to use. Although my dad would still say it's not. And you'll also hear me say like LGBT plus, LGBTQ plus, or the queer umbrella, just simply because we don't have all the time today for me to say the entire alphabet soup. The other thing I want to say is that in the 1980s, it started as just actually GLB, gay, lesbian, bisexual. That was the short acronym for this. During the AIDS epidemic, because the amount of lesbians that actually started some of the movements, such as the ACT UP movement, and there was such a huge amount of lesbians, especially in the Washington, D.C. and the New York City area, that were supporting gay men through the epidemic, it essentially became decided that the L would go in front of the G to honor the lesbians that supported throughout the healthcare system during the AIDS epidemic. So that's when the L got moved. In the early 90s, the T was added on for transgender. And then again, we continue to add more letters for the spirit of inclusion. So these are the most common letters that you'll hear. They're the first letters of the alphabet soup. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the majority of these, but I always do like to call out that the I stands for intersex, and the A stands for asexual. So intersex are individuals that are born with what we would consider ambiguous genitalia, which means that a doctor cannot determine if the child is born with a vagina or a penis, or they're born with both genitalia. It's about 2% of the population that are identified as intersex when they're born. And then asexual are people that don't experience strong sexual desire for other individuals. The other term that you'll probably hear me use frequently is cisgender. Cisgender is a term, it's been around for a very long time. We've just only been really hearing about it the last 5 to 7 years or so. But it's a term to use to describe a person whose gender identity and lived experience aligns with what has been associated with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So for example, I am a cisgender woman. I was assigned female at birth, and I still identify as female today, so I am cisgender. We also use the term gender expansive to describe any individual that does not identify as cisgender. So this includes transgender individuals, and it also includes individuals who would identify as gender fluid, which means going between the genders, or non-binary, individuals who don't identify exclusively as a boy or a girl. And one of the ways that I explain gender identity and expression to individuals, and I love using this with kids, you have access to this through transstudent.org/gender, and you can actually download non-colored copies, so you can have kids decorate and design their own. It's a really fun activity. But I always like to break down what the different gender terms mean. And as you can see from this slide, everything is on a spectrum. We have gender identity. This is what is between our ears. This is what we personally know to be true about who we are and what our identity is. We then have gender expression. This is how we present ourselves to other individuals to show our gender. We have our sex assigned at birth, strictly what is between our legs. That is the only way that we identify the sex of an individual. So when a baby is born, or during an ultrasound at 4 months, we see either a penis or a vagina and say it's going to be a boy or it's going to be a girl, or it's an intersex child. And then within our heart, we have who we are physically attracted to and who we are emotionally attracted to. All of these are separate from one another, and I always think that that's really important to recognize. We cannot tell somebody's gender identity by their gender expression. We cannot tell somebody's sexual orientation by their gender expression, right? All of these are separate, and it's important to recognize, especially with kids these days, because they are breaking down all the boundaries that we thought we had about gender and sexual orientation and who we are physically and emotionally attracted to. We can't assume that we know this information about a youth simply by looking at them. And that brings me to a quick discussion around pronouns, because pronouns also an example of something that has become much more common to talk about and to ask about an individual's pronouns over the last handful of years. And we know that the gender binary pronouns are what we are most comfortable with, right? So we have she, her, he, him. Again, I'm a cisgender woman. I identify using she, her pronouns. So if you talk behind my back, please use she, her pronouns for me. It's important to know that people, though, use non-traditional pronouns too, and that's okay, right? That's them being able to identify and feel more confident about who they are authentically. So the most common gender-neutral pronoun that we hear today is using they, them singularly, right? So identifying an individual, just one person, using they, them pronouns when speaking about them. You might work with youth who you initially meet and have names and pronouns, and then that they introduce themselves with, and then 6 months down the road, they might tell you that they have a new name or a new pronoun that they are trying to kind of put on and see how that feels. That's great, right? That's powerful. This is youth and individuals determining what feels best for their identity. And we also know that some individuals may use more than one set of pronouns. And so some individuals may use she, they pronouns. Some individuals may use he, they pronouns. Some individuals may use she, he pronouns. And that is just the opportunity for us to ask the individual, what pronouns are you using today? Right? Or sometimes if I don't want to ask overtly, I'll say, how's it going? I'm using she, her pronouns today. What about you? Right? So I'm just kind of normalizing it. Pronouns are really important. They actually are one of the easiest ways that we can affirm somebody's gender by simply using the correct pronouns. Now, here's an important thing to know though. Sometimes we don't get the pronoun correct, right? Sometimes we mess up. That is also okay. If you use an incorrect pronoun for an individual, the best thing to do is simply apologize and move on from it, right? Acknowledge it and say, oh, I meant she. I apologize for using he. Correct yourself and then just move on. So that's the best way to do it, so that we're not kind of stumbling over our words or making the situation uncomfortable. It's just a really quick apology and then moving on. The other thing is that for me, for example, as a cisgender individual, I always like to add my pronouns into my signature in my email. I like to add the pronouns into, as you can see, my Zoom name. And again, that tells people what pronouns to use for me. And it also shows people that it's safe for them to share their pronouns with me. All right, I'm going to go into intersectionality, but before I do, are there any questions? All right. So talking about intersectionality is really important because we do know that Black and Brown queer youth face significantly more challenges and unique challenges because of the multidimensional identities that they have. Right. And so what we know, and Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality. And what we know is that it's really this framework for understanding how multiple social identities at the individual level are shaped by interlocking systems of privilege as well as oppression at the society level. So we know that BIPOC youth experience unique challenges as compared to white youth. We know that queer youth experience unique challenges as compared to straight cisgender youth. But it's also important to recognize that when we have and work with youth that are black and brown as well as queer identified, they're going to face even more significant challenges. And we see this in all of the systems. We see this in the foster system. We see this in the prison system, in the school system. For our Black and brown queer youth or queer students, this intersection of identities presents distinct stressors compared to youth that identify as Black, brown only or queer only. Youth who experience multiple minoritized social positions experience much more persistent and problematic experience than youth who may experience only one minoritized social position. Talking about intersectionality is really important because it shows us that not everyone in the same group or groups have the same experiences. So the way that we work with queer youth that identify as white may look different than the way that we work and support and mentor queer youth that identify as BIPOC. And this is another another data point that I wanted to bring up. This comes from the Trevor Project. The Trevor Project is a national organization that is supporting the elimination of youth suicide of LGBTQ plus youth. So queer youth have the leading cause of death for queer youth under the age of 18 is suicide right now. And what I wanted to point out is, again, this just shows the intersectionality with multiple minoritized identities. Last year, so in 2022, 12% of white youth that identified as LGBTQ attempted suicide. That is compared to 31% of Native youth, 21% of Black youth, 21% of multiracial youth, and 18% of Latinx youth, and 12% of Asian or Pacific Islander youth. So what we see is that, and again, you can see the intersectionality when we also compare cisgender queer youth to transgender queer youth. The more intersecting identities that a child has, the increase of potential at-risk behaviors, the increase of suicide attempts, right? The increase of experiencing homelessness. At least 38 transgender and gender nonconforming individuals were killed last year because of their identity. Of those people, 81% were people of color. And this is why it's so important to acknowledge the unique experiences of intersecting identities when we are working with children. The Human Rights Campaign is always putting out this new data and making sure that we all know the names and the identity of the lives lost. And if you want more information, again, there's going to be a live link for you that you can have access to at the end of this session. One of the reasons why youth that are transgender experience more suicide and suicide ideations is because of the trauma that they experience at school, right? Youth that expressed a transgender identity experienced harassment at 78% last year, physical assault in school at 35%, and sexual violence at 12%. Last year, 75% 5% of queer youth reported that they had experienced discrimination based on their sexual orientation or gender identity at least once in their lifetime. And I promise you it's probably more than one time. And you all may see this with the youth that you mentor, right? We have these signs and symptoms of trauma when our survival brain kicks in, where we might try to run from the problem, or we run because we feel like that's how we have to survive. We might try to fight it physically, or we might just freeze from it, disengage, disassociate. I see this with youth all the time. This is why transgender youth experience such a higher dropout rate at school. As a 9th grade student, if you get suspended one time, the likelihood that you will drop out increases 4 times more than a student that doesn't get suspended. In the United States, only 16% of gender expansive youth hear positive messages about being queer in school. Only 16% feel safe in the classroom. And this is where relationships are so powerful. All the work that you all are doing to support youth, because building relationships with our youth, mentoring youth, is the precursor to building a sense of belonging, to building a sense of self-worth for these kiddos. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people right now. Queer youth are significantly more at risk. The Trevor Project last year estimated that 1.8 million queer youth seriously considered suicide. There is at least one attempt of suicide every 45 seconds of a queer child. This piece of data has always stuck with me, and if there's anything I want you to walk away with from today's session, it's this. The Trevor Project, after interviewing 15,000 queer students across the country, ages 14 to 21, showed that having one supportive adult in a child's life decreases their suicide attempt by 40%. Which means that that is any one of you that is providing gender-affirming support, gender-affirming acknowledgement of the children and the youth and young adults that you support. The majority of the adults that are supportive for our gender-expansive youth are not in the home. They're outside of the home. They're you all. Simply by being an adult that validates a child's identity is helping to decrease suicide rates among youth. Affirming transgender and non-binary youth by respecting their pronouns is associated with lower rates of suicide, simply by using the right pronouns. And sometimes we make a mistake, and like I said, we apologize and move on. So we'll finish up with, what does this look like for you all? How to be a safe and effective mentor for gender diverse children and gender diverse young adults. The first thing is to think about the paperwork that you have. Is it inclusive? Are pronouns on your paperwork? Are youth able to use the name and pronouns that they want reflected in any notes or paperwork that you have? You have to think about safety for this, so thinking about who has access to these notes or documentation. But it's really powerful to give youth and give all individuals the opportunity to add their chosen name and pronouns to any paperwork. Being able to write the name that you want to go by is so powerful. So adding a chosen name line, adding a pronoun box, right? The power of that is transformational. It's also important to recognize that we want to use the chosen name and pronoun of an individual regardless of the legal status. Like I said, it's expensive to change your name legally. Not everybody is going to be able to do it, especially if you're an individual under the age of 18. Also, think about your office environment, your workspace. Think about the laptop or the iPad that you carry around. How do youth know that you are a safe person? I always put, like, I have a rainbow flag on my computer. So when I go into school buildings, my I have this pin that I put on. Well, it says "Say Gay." Anyways, I have little things like this that you can put on your lanyard. So this one says "Say Gay." I have pronoun pins sometimes that I'll wear. It's little things like that that I promise you youth see, and they recognize, oh, that's a safe adult that I could speak to. One of the counselors that I work with at the maximum security juvenile prison in Washington State, he runs a Latino boys group and does a lot of group therapy. And he was asking me, like, there's such a machismo attitude, like, how can I show support that I am an ally for the queer community, but in a way that's a little bit more discreet. And so one of the things that he did is in his office, he put up a poster of the television show Schitt's Creek, which some of you may be familiar with. But there's two main characters in it that identify as queer, but it's very normalized within the television show. And so that is like his little way of showing the young adults that he works with, the young male adults that he works with, that he's an ally. And he has had a handful of young adults come to him and talk to him about their identity. And again, of course, acknowledging the intersecting challenges that come up with being Latino, being gay, and being in the prison system. So thinking about how can you add some safe zone signs, some rainbow flags, some human rights campaign stickers to your office environment. Also, we want to avoid assumptions. Gender expression does not equate to sexual orientation. Gender expression does not relate to maladaptive sexual behaviors. We always want to review any confidentiality procedures that you have with youth. What is said to you stays between you. And then also in your work environment, thinking about bathrooms, thinking about gendered areas. Is there a gender neutral bathroom in your workspace? Is that something that you could consider creating? When we are mentoring, we also want to consider, how do we promote resiliency? There is some part of resiliency that is inherent, but there's a lot of research being done right now behind the brain science of resiliency and how we can actually increase a child or a youth's resiliency. And part of this is focusing on their strengths. If a child comes out to you and identifies as gay or identifies as transgender, also recognizing that's not their whole personality, right? There's a lot of different elements to an individual, and making sure that we acknowledge the strength of that child. How can we foster safe friendships and peer supports? Do you know the resources in your community where youth that are gay can go to and seek support? Are there virtual group supports if a youth is not wanting to go in person? Thinking about problem-solving skills and pro-social activities, right? Talking to them about making safe friends and maintaining safe friends, and then being a good role model. Oftentimes when we talk about, and this presentation essentially kind of explains that, but we talk a lot about the hardship that transgender and gender expansive youth face. And we emphasize, some of the problems that we see. But how can we talk to our queer youth about the beauty of them being able to live their authentic self and the beauty that comes with knowing who you are and trusting who you are? Right? How can we be a good role model and show, visuals, show representation of queer couples, right? Of children that grow up that are transgender, that grow up to live beautiful lives. It's, of course, important for you to educate yourself. That's why you all are here today. And do research, and I have some resources for you in at the end of this session, but do research that is correct. There's a lot of misinformation out there. I'm an education consultant for the Gender Clinic in Tacoma and Seattle, Washington, and I will tell you there is so much wrong information about transgender and gender affirming care for youth under the age of 18, right? So asking questions, who are other mentors you could kind of navigate and problem solve with? Consult with other people, attend more trainings. And then lastly, just some mistakes to avoid. In terms of phrases, we want to avoid making comments like, are you sure? Have you thought through this? How do you know it isn't a phase? I promise you, if a youth is coming out to you, they have spent years of their life thinking through this, right? The other phrase I always tell people to avoid is, life is going to be a lot harder for you now. Because again, I promise you, if a gender expansive or a queer youth is coming out to you, they already know life is going to be a lot harder for them. We want to avoid critiquing any outness of an individual, which means we want to make sure, every person is on their own journey when they come out. And so we want to avoid outing them, right? So we want to avoid telling their story for them. And we also want to avoid saying like, well, maybe you shouldn't tell other people that right now. Let them explore and experience their journey on their own. And then, of course, we want to avoid stereotyping. All right, that is the information I have for you. I will tell you, I do these trainings sometimes, 4-hour half-day sessions. So I put a lot of information in a short amount of time for you today. So please feel free, if you have more questions, you're always welcome to email me. Like I said, you will have access to the slide deck. I will make sure that that Emma or Tamis or somebody sends out the slide deck to the attendees today. And you do have access to a couple more resources that are very specific for the mentoring programs.
Thank you so much for presenting today. I feel like I learned a lot, and it's been great.
Good.
So I'm going to open up the Q&A. We would love if you put your questions in the chat. There was one that was sent in before we started today. How do you make the transition without support of family as a minor?
So you can, a couple things. You can do a social transition. So a social transition is when you are able to, style your hair the way that you want, wear the clothes the clothes that you want to wear. Oftentimes, for some youth, that means that they might change into clothes at school. They might, not be able to express themselves that way at home. But what I would say is that as a mentor of a child or a young adult who is transgender and does not have family that is supportive, for you to just be the support system, regardless of what they are able to present as in front of you. Ask them what name do they want to use. Ask them what pronouns do they want to use. Because that's the most powerful thing, right? Is being able to be seen for who they are by other adults. And because legally, you cannot start hormone therapy or what we call hormone replacement therapy or puberty blockers without parent consent. Other questions?
Pam, I see you came off mute, but I can't hear you. So if you have a question, maybe type it in the chat. Well, I have a question if no one else has one. So spaces like these, it's really great to ask questions. What would you recommend if you're a mentor and you're unsure about what's appropriate to ask a youth? Where do they get some of the resources on what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, what's moving too fast, what is pushing them beyond what they're comfortable with? Anything, any advice on that?
Yeah, I always go with the speed that the youth wants to go at. So there's some youth. So I'm a foster parent as well, and uh, in Washington State, and I don't know the foster system in Virginia, but in Washington State, we have a significantly high number of youth that are transgender that have been kicked out of their homes. We see this nationally. And so I pretty much exclusively foster high school age students that are transgender that have been removed from their home. And this is a great example of kids that I am not able to provide them any type of medical intervention, so any type of hormone therapy, because I'm not their birth parent. And being able to just check in with them and say, what do you want to talk about today? How can I support you? What's on your mind? What are you concerned about? Right? There's a lot of things that youth want to talk about, but they don't know how, or they don't know if it's appropriate or if it's okay for them to talk to us as adults about it, especially adults if we're new to them or mentors to them and we see them maybe weekly or even less than weekly sometimes. And so just checking in with them about like where are they at and what do they want to talk about. The other thing I will do with youth is I will help them research resources together. I always get worried about kids, even high school age kids, jumping on some type of virtual platform to ask questions because it's amazing how much wrong information is out there. And so I will sit with them at a computer and do the research together. Let me see, there's some more. When someone you work with who's male but identifies as female by name, how do you ask or find out how they identify as? Yeah, that's a great question. And the best thing to do is ask them, and it's not disrespectful to ask them. And so I would say, oh, I notice people use he, him pronouns for you, and I hear that you go by this name. How do you want me to identify you? Do you want me to use he, him pronouns? Do you want me to use she, her pronouns? It's completely appropriate. And I will tell you, they will feel so grateful that somebody asked them.
Well, if you all have any more questions, feel free to send them to me or to Tovah directly. I think your information is going to be in the slides. I'm just going to drop a survey real quick, and then Cindy is going to take it away with some of the closing information.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for being with us here today. Our next coffee hour will be next month first. And we'll let you know, we'll send these letters and let you know about that so you can register. And so thank you everyone for being here with us in Tovah. It was very interesting and we learned so much. And yes, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of changes coming up here in Virginia. And just hopefully we can take something that we learned today and just learn more about trans and youth and how we can approach them. So thank you everyone. We're gonna end now. And just be alert that we are gonna send emails with newsletters about our next coffee hour next month.